Testing, testing. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session titled From Vision to Implementation, Making Complete Streets Work. Thank you for all of you who've joined us for this session, and we'll be here for the next hour. So my name is Eric Dexter. I'm the Director of Business Development for Civil Solutions Consulting Group, which is a local civil engineering, surveying, and consulting firm based here in the Baton Rouge area. And I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this panel with some of these experts who work in the field of engineering and planning that make complete streets work. And so just to give you a little bit of a rundown of the session, we have a little bit of a treat that each panelist here, including myself, has a picture of. They're going to talk to you a little bit more of how that describes what complete streets means to them. And before I get to that, I'll run through some of their bios before I actually introduce you to my slide. So our first panelist that we have here today, well, actually before I get to that, I want to thank the sponsors that are here today, that have sponsored this program that you've seen in between the breaks, and in particular the sponsor for this session, which is Lipsy. So please give them a round of applause and thank them for their help. So the first panelist we have here today is Kim Marasek, who has 28 years of community planning experience at the regional, parish, municipal, and neighborhood scales. She has specialized in working with local governments, leading community planning efforts, and finding creative solutions to address local issues. She also has experience in post-disaster recovery, long-term community resilience, and building transportation planning. Welcome, Kim. Next, we have Brian Nunes, who's the Transportation Alternatives Program Manager at the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development. Brian is a licensed professional engineer with 20 years of experience in the private sector, parish government, and state government. During his time at DOTD, he has been responsible for the project development and funding of over 100 bicycle and pedestrian projects throughout the state, benefiting communities of all size. Next, we have April Lennard, who's the principal and owner of Gray Engineering, a firm with a specific goal of providing technical assistance to small communities who need help implementing complete streets. April spent the majority of her career working for state government and in some private consulting firms, small and large, with over 16 years of experience in the transportation field, with a focus on traffic and safety. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Ruley, who is the Mobility and Safety Division Manager for the City of New Orleans Department of Public Works. The focus of this newly formed division is to ensure multimodal design in street projects that improves mobility options and increases safety for people walking, biking, and accessing transit and driving. Ms. Ruley brings a diverse background in public, private, and the nonprofit sectors and experience of fields of engineering, public health, and transportation planning. Give a round of applause for our panelists here this evening. So first, I'll kick off my slide that I decided to choose for you this afternoon. And some of you have been here in 2018 when I gave my Pecha Kucha, which I hope some of you were here last night to see some of the panelists discuss theirs. But this is a scene from the movie Friday, which you may or may not remember, but it was about two friends who were trying to come up with enough money to keep themselves alive from somebody who was trying to get their money back from Smokey sitting here on your far left. But this is Smokey, that's Felicia of the Bye Felicia infamous saying now that people have overused, and also Craig sitting on their front porch. Now, why did I decide to use a slide from the movie Friday to describe complete streets? Well, my talk that I gave was about how the characters in the community actually make up the fabric of the community. When someone who's not in the community look at them as some threats or some elements. But one thing that I always remembered about the movie Friday was people sitting on a front porch talking to neighbors. And part of the reason they were able to do that is because you had Debbie, who was running up and down the street all day. Lizelle, who was trying to borrow a car or borrow some money, but he walked safely on sidewalks. And then you had Felicia, who needed to borrow a stereo. She needed to borrow a VCR. That's what community is, and that's what complete streets mean to me. And last but not least, you had Debo, who was a neighborhood bully, but he safely stole and took Red's bike and got to and from where he needed to go all throughout this Friday. So that's what my slide is, and that's what complete streets means to me. And next, I will kick it over to Kim, and she'll talk a little bit more about her slide and also about the work that she's doing in her field and with CPEX. Kim, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, there we go. So this slide, if you're from Baton Rouge, well, actually from anywhere in Louisiana, this will look very familiar to you. So the reason that I selected this slide, Beth Osborne yesterday mentioned that Baton Rouge is the 11th most dangerous city for pedestrians in the country. And I think if you look at this slide, you can pretty much see why. I think pretty much everywhere across the state, you can find something like this in your community. And I think even worse, you may see this 4-lane divided roadway without even the sidewalk on the side that people struggle to get down. I think, relatively speaking, no one would use this facility if they didn't have to. And so I think about when these types of facilities are in our most disinvested neighborhoods where residents lack access to vehicles or transit, it becomes a dangerous barrier that further limits access to jobs and essential services. On the positive side, this is on Plank Road, which if you're around Baton Rouge, you have heard recently there was a very robust planning activity that happened over the last couple of years to really reimagine Plank Road. And I think the reason that I wanted to highlight this today is to say that that type of activity, I know that was multi-agency, that was expensive, there were a lot of private consultants involved in that process, but it involved the community deeply in the conversation. And I think that's really the key important factor when we're thinking about complete streets and how to come to a good design. We, as professional planners, designers, engineers, we look at that picture and immediately start thinking about what needs to happen to that street, right? We're like, oh my God, the sidewalks are a mess, we need maybe a road diet. We start thinking immediately about what the solutions should be. And I think the challenge for us is that we should first be going to the community and asking them, what are your challenges? How do you navigate this? What is most important to you about making this a better environment for you? Where are your destinations? Where are the crashes happening? Where are the near misses happening? And I think, as professionals and advocates, building that knowledge and awareness at the local level is where we build champions and where projects become developed and where they take legs and start moving forward. Another kind of piece to this is, I think, working with local communities, oftentimes an elected official or another advocate will come and say, here's the problem, we need a sidewalk, right? And so maybe that's a solution, maybe that's part of the solution, maybe that isn't the solution at all. So I think, again, it's challenging when communities kind of predetermine what they think the outcome needs to be in order to make a complete street. And I think part of our job is to make sure that they have the education about different countermeasures, different elements, and really the full scope of what a complete street could be in order to meet their local needs, and to look at those as individual roadways and corridors, and make sure that we're engaging deeply with the community, and then bringing the data back to them to show them really that it supports everything they've already said. Those feelings that they have are always borne out by the data. So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to April.
And before we go to April, I call a real quick audible because I forgot to include one important step, and that was defining what complete streets is. I just don't want to assume that we all know what that definition is, or what complete streets is to one of us may not mean that for the rest of us. So I just wanted to kind of recite the definition that Smart Growth America uses, which is complete streets is an approach to planning, design, building, operating, and maintaining streets that enable safe access for all people who need to use them, including pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities. That sound good, panelists? Okay, great. Thanks. I will pass it over to April now, who will talk a little bit more about her slide and about the work that she's doing.
So first I want to say I'm April and I'm a recovering traffic engineer or a recovering state employee. And I actually almost picked a picture of Government Street because when I first started in the safety group at DOTD, it was 2010, and we first conceived of the idea of doing a road diet on Government Street, and it just got constructed and finished in 2021. Very frustrating to take 11 years and then, finally get to the place where you see all your hard work come to fruition. But I picked this street instead because Complete Streets, based on the context, doesn't necessarily have to be complicated. It doesn't have to have dedicated space for every mode. I think the difference is that you have to think about speed and the context and the land use surrounding it. I did fail to mention, I've been on a roller coaster this year. I started my own business in February. I left the state after 11 years and worked for a larger consulting firm, CSRs, to follow MoveBR, actually. I wanted to see East Baton Rouge's Bike Ped Master Plan implemented through MoveBR. It lasted about a year, and then I worked at a smaller firm, GoTech, for another year or so, and then decided that I really wanted to be on my own so that I could be unfiltered, unapologetic, and do the work that I really am passionate about. So my engineering firm is called Gray, because it's not always black and white. So just wanted to start with that too. I had to put that plug in for it. So again, back to the picture. Again, it doesn't have to be over-engineered. We don't have to have dedicated space, but it's all about thinking about context and speed. And you know, Beth did cover you know, the focus on safety, but she didn't explicitly explain the safe system approach. And a lot of the federal programs that our previous speakers talked about are really looking for that safe system approach in all aspects of every project. And the safe system approach is recognizing that humans will make mistakes, but it's not acceptable for those mistakes to be fatal. So if you think about speed and somebody trying to cross a street that's high volume, high speed, they're just not, you know, they're not gonna make it. That's why we don't allow people to walk on interstates. But if you think about speed and the human, they have research and data, you know, at 23 miles an hour, if a pedestrian is hit, they have a 10% chance of death. 90% of the time they'll survive. So a low speed environment, lends itself well to mixing uses. But if you go to a 42 miles an hour, which is your typical futon of roads and a lot of what we have in the Baton Rouge area and probably across the state, it's a 50-50 shot. You cross in Florida Boulevard, I don't know if they're going 42, but if they're going 58, your chances of surviving are slim. 90% of the time, it's fatal. So thinking about those opportunities to reduce speeds where it really matters, where modes do mix, and making sure that we're making those compromises, because it's not all about moving single occupancy vehicles as quickly as possible. So one of the other tidbits I wanted to share about being at the state for 11 years, I was kind of an inside advocate, I guess, if you will, and I fought internal battles a lot. But what I did understand after 11 years is that, you know, they're good people, but it's the system that breaks that sort of passion within. And, you know, the motivations of the state, they're not just about moving people, but they move freight as well. So they have this road transfer program, which a lot of you probably have heard about. There's a lot of state-owned roadways that really shouldn't be state-owned. So as a local agency, your best bet is to take your roads over and do whatever you want with them if it's on their road transfer program. Let's see. Also, anticipate pushback. You know, a lot of times when you're asking for things that are outside of the norm, you're probably gonna get no, but anticipate that and be ready for explaining why you still wanna ask. And build consensus. Make sure that you have consensus before you ask for what you're, and I think that's what Kim was talking about with Plank Road and the public engagement that they have with that process. Such a great process. I guess that's it for now. I think I kept it within 3.
Thank you, April. Next, we'll move on to Jennifer. And let's see. Okay, great.
Do you have anyone from New Orleans in the house? Oh, you use your mic.
Okay, that's better. So raise your hands again, New Orleans folks. All right, there are quite a few people here. I've got a bit of a New Orleans perspective here, but I've lived all over the state in large and small towns. So I think that what I have to say can be related to your town, your parish. So I want to talk about one roadway in the city of New Orleans that's produced a whopping 16% of all traffic fatalities just this year. One roadway in the city of New Orleans has produced 21% of all traffic fatalities involving pedestrians just this year. That's 6 out of 28. And one roadway in the city of New Orleans has already cost society more than $119 million just this year due to loss of lives. And that roadway is US 90 Chef Mentor Highway, which in English translates to Chief Liar. It stretches between central New Orleans and the Mississippi state line. Prior to the construction of the interstate through New Orleans, this roadway was the primary connector for folks traveling between New Orleans and southeastern states. 6 decades ago, Chef Mentor served as a means for expanding housing and industry for what was still a growing city. Some of you may be familiar with the New York Times bestseller, The Yellow House by Sarah Broom, which tells the story of her family home at Wilson and Chef Mentor Highway and the history, culture, and racial tensions of New Orleans East and the cataclysmic effects of Hurricane Katrina. I highly recommend it. In the years before and after Hurricane Katrina, the area around Chef Highway, as we call it, experienced economic stagnation and decline despite efforts to revitalize. Fast forward to today and a trip down Chef Mentor Highway with its 6 lanes, intermittent and missing sidewalks, lack of shoulders in some areas, speed limits that range from 40 miles per hour to 55 miles per hour, and ubiquitous driveways. I think most would agree this roadway is out of sync with today. So I ask, how can roadways like Chef Highway better deliver on benefits for today and tomorrow and to the future? How can they produce more good than harm? Complete Streets is a good start. But Chef is one of those countless state highways and local roadways that can be found in every city, town, and parish in Louisiana, and in America, for that matter. So I ask you, what is your Chef Mentor Highway? What is that roadway that could better serve the needs of the community? Does that roadway produce health, economic, I can't even read my writing. Social and environmental benefits to your community? A roadway like Chef Mentor is not a cakewalk for Complete Streets implementation. In fact, it represents the edges, the stretching of boundaries as to what Complete Streets outcomes are possible. One moment. This requires a lot of vision, hard work, and collaboration. There is no silver bullet, but starting with a few key elements can translate into big benefits and build momentum. And to this end, the City of New Orleans is collaborating with the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development to leverage Transportation Alternative Program funds to build sidewalks, shrink driveways, and introduce safer crossings. While this is a small but incremental step forward, it will take deliberate and thoughtful actions by all involved. And these types of actions are already happening in Louisiana. Can you fast forward to the next slide? This year, the New Orleans installed its first pedestrian hybrid beacon, which is a Federal Highways Administration proven countermeasure that is shown to reduce pedestrian crashes by a significant amount. And in the next slide, I show communities have developed a suite of requirements and incentives to developers and property owners to redefine sidewalks, provide reasonable access for cars, and green our streetscapes. So to conclude, Complete Streets policies are really critical and can ensure that the needs of all roadway users are considered in roadway design, especially when projects meet resistance. But sometimes an incremental approach is needed, starting with critical improvements such as making sidewalks legible and continuous and improving crossing safety are 2 simple examples of changes that can stem the tide of degradation and produce much-needed community benefits now and into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next, we'll go over to Brian.
All right, thank you. This is a picture I took in Gainesville, Florida. I was down there for the LSU Florida game this year, and go Tigers. We had a good time. Me and my buddies were down there, and pulled out my phone. He said, "Man, you're taking a picture of a sidewalk." I said, "Well, you don't quite get it. You know, they don't see it the way we see it." If you look closely, it's hard to see because I didn't do landscape or whatever you're supposed to do on an iPhone. But on one side, you've got pedestrian stuff. On the other side, you have a bike lane. And then you have a completely separated multi-use path, all on the same state highway. It was just very well done. There were transit stops. It was signed properly. The crossings were great. I mean, if there were levels of Complete Street, I mean, this one's in the SEC. It was great. So I took a picture of it, and I said, we need to start getting things like this in Baton Rouge, in New Orleans, everywhere in Louisiana. But then I thought about it, and I was listening to Eric's definition earlier, and it's pretty vague about, not vague, but it's loose. It's not targeted at every single area. And I think that's because complete streets mean different things to different cities. Gainesville has thousands and thousands of students. They're on foot, they're on bike, they're running, they're walking, they're scooters, they had the scooter rentals and the bike shares, and they had all of that, and they were using it all because I know they screamed at me many times. It didn't sound like Go Tigers, there was something in it, but they were vocal. But that is a complete street for Gainesville, okay? That's not a complete street maybe for the city of Abbeville, and I'm not picking on Abbeville, I just see the mayor over here, so. So I think it's up to us to define what a complete street is in our own communities, and it's on the planners to meet with the governments. And it's not a one-size-fit-all. Everybody has their own needs. As long as we're accommodating the non-motorized transportation, that's the whole goal. We want the safety of our pedestrians, our bikes, our handicap. We don't need everything, but we need something. And that's kind of leads me into basically the whole topic of this session was from vision to implementation, how to make complete streets work. The biggest hurdle between vision and implementation is funding. And that's kind of my main job, is to fund these projects. But we've done some beautiful projects in New Orleans with Jennifer. We've done them in Kenner. We've done them in Jefferson Parish. East Baton Rouge has some great ones. Even Lafayette, I saw Nick and Kathy earlier. They're getting into it and really, really moving. But I don't see them in Lake Providence. I don't see them in Crowville. I don't see them in White Castle. We don't do any projects there. If you start looking at it, at DOTD, we have one policy. It's 80-20 on construction. You have a 20% construction match, and all your design fees, all your construction engineering, that's 100% local. That just doesn't make sense. You sit back and think about it. A sidewalk costs just as much to design and build in Faraday, Louisiana, as it does in New Orleans, Louisiana. The difference is, I mean, in the 2010 census, those two towns, there's an 895,000 person difference in the tax base. So if you take a high level look at it, there's no equity in that. You know, I mean, it's just not fair. So we said, how can we change it? We made policy change. Well, I've kind of pushed this thing for a long time, and I've got some great partners at the federal highway level here in Louisiana, and we've worked together, gone back and forth, figured out how to make it work. And well, I got good news. I think I saw Laura. Laura's here. Yeah, Laura's one of my great partners at Federal Highway. And great news is that we got it approved, and I'm going to go into how it's going to change for rural communities here in just a second. First, I'm going to use an example so I can go back to this example after I explain the changes. The town of Grand Coteau, probably not many people here know where it is, but they applied for a TAP project a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago. And it was a sidewalk going through their town. There are no sidewalks out there. It's a very rural community, 964 people, that's their population. And it's a low mod income. I think it's probably more low income, but it's really, they're transit dependent. They're distressed, they're rural. I mean, they meet all of the high priority categories that are in the new infrastructure law. But anyway, they applied for this project, and it was $500,000. Okay, so take that, use their 20% match. So they have to come up with 20% construction. So that's $100,000 they have to come up with right off the top. Then they have to go hire somebody to design the thing. Rough number, use another 10% for that. So another 50,000. So now they're in for 150,000. Then they have to hire somebody to do the construction engineering and inspection. Say another 10%. That's another 50 grand. So this $500,000 sidewalk that they wanted, all of a sudden, they got to come out of pocket $200,000. These people weren't sure if they turned on their faucet, what color the water was going to be, okay? And I have to charge them this much for a sidewalk? So, no, we're not doing that anymore. So under our new policies, the communities that are, right now, it's a pilot program. This is our first year doing it. 50,000 or less, we're going to pay all the design fees. DOTD, we're going to, with our federal partners, there's not going to be any cost for design or CE&I for these small communities. Second part of it, based on population, it's not going to be 80-20 across the board. The MPO areas, sorry, you're still 80-20. Nothing changes for you guys. But the areas less than 200,000, they're going to go to an 85-15 match. So their percentage went from 20 to 15%. The communities between 5 and 50,000, you guys go to 90-10. And then the rural, small, tiny communities that are less than 5,000 population, they go to 95-5. So using that same Grand Coteau example for the $500,000 sidewalk that was going to cost them $200,000, under these new changes, they have to come out of pocket $25,000, and that's it. They get their project for an eighth of what it should have cost them before. So that's our big changes that we're making. That's how we're going to address our rural, our low-income communities. Now, that's not to say that we don't have these distressed, transit-dependent, low-income within our MPO areas. We certainly do. We know that. And I have plans to address that. Not going to get into it right here because I haven't got it approved yet, but I just got the first hurdle. That's my pilot program, phase 1. They didn't even know phase 2 is coming, but it's already ready up here. So the email's drafted. Now that I got the approval this week, I'm going to send that thing Monday morning and start setting up meetings again. So we're going to address with some other money how to offset the cost in the MPO areas just for those high priority areas, the high priority communities. If we're going to stay in the normal, the upper income areas, that's fine. We can do projects there too, but that's going to come out of the city's match or the MPO's match. We want to hit this equity component really hard, whether we're in the MPOs or we're outside the MPOs. This is the first step, but it's not the last.
Thank you, Brian. Keeping on the topic of funding, oftentimes when you have funding constraints, even if you get some assistance from the state or from the feds, you still have to make trade-offs locally. You know, whether you're going to have, how you're going to determine versus on-street parking versus bike lanes. Are you going to have this separated multi-use path like we see here on your picture that you use? How do you, from either your perspective and the rest of the panelists as well, how do you navigate that when you have to make trade-offs? How do you deal with the public and what the citizens want versus what you literally can only implement from a funding perspective?
Well, your first step is always to involve the people who use the facilities. I mean, the community involvement is where every project should start before you even think about an application. You know, have a poster board with Post-it notes and have everybody come in and say, this is what I'd like to see. You do one with the community, but also you got to consider your businesses that are in the area. They have an input too, because they create some of the traffic that generates to allow these projects. So it's really a reach out. It's a public reach out that starts from the local government. That's where it needs to begin. And we'd love to help. You know, we can use our past experience, whether not just me at the state, but Jennifer, April, Kim, everybody who's dealt with these type of things before. We can help moderate those easily. That's what we enjoy doing.
I'd like to add something as well. We also can use data. You know, we have a plethora of data. Sometimes accessing it is a challenge, but if you can get your hands on data, a lot of times you can quantify these things. You can do a benefit cost analysis. It can get really complicated, but it doesn't have to be. But as soon as you start measuring the goals of the project, so if you want to increase walkability, you want to count pedestrians, and you want to do that before and after a project. But that's the story you need to tell, I think, in deciding these trade-offs.
And maybe I'll just pick up on what you started laying down, April. I think, that initial outreach to the community and having those conversations about where are they trying to go, from point A to point B, what are the challenges and obstacles that they're facing, and really digging into what values at the community level are they trying to achieve with this project, and I think that helps inform then the ultimate design, and also really thinking about what is the existing land use on either side, what is the future land use going to be on either side of that road once it's built out. And I think another thing to think about with these projects is, doing the most immediate needs, addressing the most immediate needs, and then there may be an opportunity to come back and make some amendments and revisions, as the situation changes over time.
Yeah, and making a space that might be easily converted to something else. Like if you do on-street parking initially, if biking demand increases, it's a restriping. It's not, moving curbs.
Thank you. Sure, go ahead, John.
I would also add that sometimes when let's say the governmental entities come into a neighborhood and they're focused on that one street, but the neighborhood folks come out and say, but what about these other streets? Or we need these other things. Or what about the lighting? Or what about So it always helps to get a feel for the community. If you are one of those people coming in from like the local government or even a funding agency to say, what are the needs, or is there the ability of, can we address some of those needs while we're here and not just focus on the one street? Because that comes up time and time again that, look, you're talking about this one street, but what about all these other problems we have? So.
Sure, thank you. One of the things that I think about a lot, I sit on the Baton Rouge Complete Street Citizens Advisory Council, also on the Sustainable Transportation Action Committee with the City of Baton Rouge, and I often think about, we have a lot of resources here, as I'm sure the City of New Orleans does, but in some of the more rural areas, they may not have these committees formed. They may not have a policy or ordinance that's been implemented. And I always think that those that know, those that don't. So how do you recommend, citizens from other more rural communities, smaller communities who may not have the capacity or the resources that some of our larger metropolitan areas advocate on behalf of complete streets, which, by the way, they may not even know the definition of what a complete street is, but they know what they need in their community, which is safe and accessible transportation options.
So Brian mentioned Crowville earlier. Has anybody ever heard of Crowville? Awesome. I'm going there next week, actually, because they want to build sidewalks, and they have the right-of-way, they've got subsurface drainage. It's actually probably going to be a pretty inexpensive fix, and they might be able to do their whole city for a TAP application. But what I bring up Crowville for is because they don't have an actual government. They have a police jury, but Crowville is not governed directly. I guess they have, relationships with the parish police jury, but they started a nonprofit, a Friends of Crowville group, so that they could crowdsource, they could fund technical assistance, they could get everybody on the same page and centralize communication. So that's just one example. There's a way you can structure it outside of, formal governmental processes.
I would probably add to that too. There's so many resources on the internet about complete streets, and so I think, there's so much self-education that local communities can do, in addition to reaching out to their partner agencies, whether it's their parish government that's adjacent or within their community. Their regional planning commissions are always a good resource for them. Certainly CPEX would love to help them and provide some additional information for them and help them navigate the process of project development.
And LSU Ag Center, I know they're in the audience, they're a good resource as well.
One other thing with the rural communities, like Kim was saying, there are plenty of online resources, but we've got to make sure that they're careful, that they don't get overwhelmed. If they come and see a picture like that's on the screen right there, they say, wow, forget it, complete streets aren't for us because we can't do that. And that's why I want them to all realize that that's, like I said, that's overkill. That's complete Earth Street there. But
if it's a high-speed road, it might be a good fit.
right, yeah. Could be.
And I think I do think, sorry, Jennifer, it does come down to kind of just the basics of community planning, right? Like, I think whenever we go into a community and start having these conversations, we immediately start gravitating towards how are people moving around? What are their challenges? In small communities, rural communities, often it centers around their main street. And all of a sudden, we start having these conversations about, well, we need to improve the parking in our main street. We need to green our main street. And then we start talking about, well, how are people actually getting to your main street? And how are they navigating your main street? And, so I think it really starts with a conversation.
Yeah, I agree with all those points. I was just going to say, Brian, I don't know if you took this on a weekend or something, but there aren't a lot of people in the picture. And I think on a normal day of, when the university is open, it probably has more people.
I think they had just lost the night before, so.
Sure, I'll move on to the next question here. What are some of the typical hurdles or barriers to getting complete streets built, and how can communities address them?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Well, I think
The
you
biggest
may
barrier
have
is
touched
funding.
on,
There's always-
Brian, I'm sure all of you kind of touched on this in your opening introductions. So if you want to kind of go into a little bit more detail of maybe some real world experiences that you've had, either as a citizen or working from, the government side or even the private sector, of what are the typical hurdles that someone would experience? And how do you overcome
I'm
them?
slightly jaded, so I don't want to say too much to get myself in trouble, but, a lot of it is politics. It's finding the right people. And I think there was a session yesterday, John Spain was asking who's in charge. That's a great question, because I really sometimes have no clue. And, decisions on projects I've seen and how they flip, and that's a challenge in itself. And I think going back to the project manager, like who's responsible for the scope and the budget and the schedule of that project, is probably a really good start.
There's other hurdles, but you kind of touched on some there. The timeline it takes, because we can get people to buy in for a certain amount of time. Hey, this is a great idea, let's go ahead and do it. But then the plans stay at DOTD back and forth for 3 or 4 years, and the momentum just dries up, and nobody wants, we're still doing that thing. So then they want to spend their money other places, and then we got a new administration come in, and they have different priorities, so that project just goes away, and it just dies. And then, a new administration come in and say, hey, we want to do another project, but the motivation's gone, so they don't have the public support anymore. And then the whole program gets a bad reputation. So who is in charge? With my program, I'm in charge. I'll tell you that right now. And I'm streamlining that stuff so we don't have to have projects sit for 5, 10 years anymore. I think the quick return on the initial, not financial investment, but the emotional investment, that's how we can keep these things going.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I mean, if you have a lull in a project, you're gonna lose a lot of your, as you said, momentum, and then you end up having to do your engagement over because people don't remember you did your engagement. And where did this project come from? I didn't approve this project, and did I vote on this? I don't remember voting on this, and So I think that, finding ways to deliver, within a year or two on something, whether it be something minor, maybe the bigger project's going to take too long, and you're going to still do the big project, but in the meantime, you're going to, fix some lighting, and you're going to repair some sidewalks or plant some trees, that sort of thing. And then people can start to get a taste for that it's actually going to happen. And so it sounds easier than it really is, though, because that means I can't do all those little things myself. I have to coordinate with other agencies, with other priorities, et cetera. But in terms of if you're someone in just Joe Q public and you want to see something happen on your street, I think doing enough research to know who's making the decisions, who funds these kind of things, and starting to have conversations with your neighbors, with the businesses in the area, and then bringing those concerns or issues or ideas to the people with the ability to implement. And for me, it makes it a lot easier for me to work in a community where I know who to talk to and know how, I know some of the concerns of the neighborhood. And that way, that helps me to target, deliver on something that will be useful in the interim and then ultimately with the bigger project.
And I'll just add, from a practical standpoint, not knocking DOTD, working on state roads is so much more complicated than working on local roads. And so if you're in a community, a small community, or you're entering into this conversation about complete streets, look for opportunities that maybe exist in your local streets where you have more flexibility. There's opportunities that you can do with paint, with striping. There's temporary installations that can happen that just give the public the sense that you're moving in the direction that they want to go. It could be as simple as painting a crosswalk, putting in curb lines, adding some elements or planters on the street. These don't always have to be permanent installations, and that those give the community a sense that things are moving in the direction they want to see.
Thank you. The word equity is something that's been mentioned quite often throughout this summit over the 2 days here. And I thought Mr. Silver's definition, when he was giving out his definitions yesterday of diversity, equity, inclusion, I think he said equity was just like fairness. And so when you think about fairness, you think about equity throughout these communities. We've been talking about funding issues. We've been talking about the hurdles and obstacles that you have to overcome. And again, I mention oftentimes those that know, those that don't. How do we incorporate equity into our decision-making process, not only to even get projects considered, but to make sure they're delivered in an equitable manner?
So I was thinking about this on the way up, and in order to actually deliver equitable outcomes, you have to operationalize equity. So you have to integrate equity into your everyday operations and decision-making and prioritizations. And so we can talk about equity when we're, talking about a big project or big investment, that sort of thing. But if our day-to-day operations of how does that mother of four who lives in a house with a broken water line outside of her house and a street light out, if that person doesn't have access to resources and a response to those resources, then you can talk about equity all you want. It's just a sort of a abstract thought. So I think that the best thing we can do is figure out ways that we can operationalize equity into our day-to-day operations. And then when you do have those opportunities for big programs, look at ways that you can actually use data to identify, how do we define equity, and then ask the community to help you to define it as well. So work together to define what equity is. Because I can say from personal experience, like if I only worked on the projects and priorities that when I get a phone call from city council or from that neighborhood organization who's always calling, I would create very inequitable outcomes. I myself would be guilty of creating inequity. So you have to be able to have those hard conversations with those people who are in power to say, look, if I only work on your stuff to solve your constituents' issues, I'm not serving that other community. So you have to be able to use data and those other ways to say, this is also a need. And if you want to be part of an equitable solution, you would help us to figure out how we can deliver on these other issues.
I'd also like to say that complete streets by definition is equity, right? I mean, we're building roads for everyone. That's our goal. And so I think if we are able to institutionalize a complete streets policy, and a policy is just one step, but taking that policy and integrating it into the everyday processes that Jennifer was talking about. You know, we have design checklists, we've got manuals, we've got, I don't know, so many things out there, but if it's not integrated into each one of those things, then, you know, we're shooting ourselves in the foot with the policy. So by definition, if we integrate complete streets policy within what we do, I think that we are building equitable transportation.
And I would add, if we add safety, a safety lens on that, we're probably, you know, hitting a lot of the most needed locations in our communities. And I think, you know, I'm not sure who said it yesterday, you know, somebody was talking about the power that we have as individuals in leadership positions. And I kind of following on what you said, Jennifer, you know, as I've worked in local governments over my career, I've had to have those conversations with elected officials, with the parish president, with the mayors to say, you know, I understand and there's a need in community X. The biggest benefit you're gonna get is to invest in your neighborhood Y, because that is the community that has the greatest need. And, you know, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And so we need to be investing in those areas of our community that have the greatest need in order to bring the whole community up to the standard that we want to be and thrive as a whole community. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to really lead those conversations.
Is having a complete streets policy a must? Is it, I'm assuming it's important, not sure you probably would agree with that, but is it a must? Is it necessary from your experience?
Depends on the funding source. No, I think it's a great first step, but I don't think it's necessarily a requirement. I mean, you can get an award for a great policy, but if you're not doing anything with it, then, you know, it's pointless. So I don't think it's absolutely necessary. I think a plan is also important. You know, you need to know where your priorities are, because you can't build everything yet tomorrow. You have to prioritize the needs by using data. So policies, plans, both great tools, but you got to do even more than that.
And I think I'd add, I think a policy is really important. If nothing else, it signals the direction that the community is willing to go. You know, and theoretically, if that policy, you know, I guess if it's adopted by executive order, like yours was, Jennifer, you know, that's a direction from the highest elected official in the community that says to their staff members, this is important. We are going to follow this direction. And that, I think that creates alignment among departments within a jurisdiction. In addition, if that policy is adopted by a council or a board of aldermen and as a resolution, similarly, that provides that kind of backbone to the marching orders to the staff to say, this is important to this community. And so I think it is important. It's an important first step, and I think, but I don't think that should stop communities from, you know, moving forward with complete streets projects if they see that, I mean, as they see those needs in their community.
I would say you should definitely start doing incremental changes. You know, even if you don't have a policy, you can still, you know, introduce different types of complete streets approaches if you have projects that are moving through the pipeline. And that's how New Orleans started. We just started integrating. First thing I did when I got into City Hall was we had a Canal Street revitalization project, major, like tens of millions of dollars going into rebuilding sidewalks and making them really fancy and granite and brick and all kinds of stuff. And so I introduced bike racks into that scenario, having not been involved in the design process, but it was something we can add to like make it a little bit more complete. And so sometimes those little changes end up being, you know, something that has a long-term impact and can affect other projects. But I would say going back to policy is New Orleans started with an ordinance in 2011. we didn't adopt a full policy until 2015, because we kept on saying, well, wait, it seems like we need something else, like an ordinance just isn't doing it. We need to make sure this is operational, and that I don't have to keep telling the engineer, the chief engineer, hey, Complete Streets, there was an ordinance, remember that, So it ensures consistency in delivery across all the folks who are involved. And then more recently, we modified that policy again. So we've been making iterative changes to our policy to make it even better. And the last change that we did was with what's the New Orleans Complete Streets Coalition. So the advocates were at the table informing the need for more performance measures and so forth. Now, we don't have, not everything's perfect, and we struggle with just being able to capture or catch projects as they're moving through the pipeline. But we do a pretty good job of ensuring that we do have some Complete Streets elements. And we are hoping in the next few months to launch a dashboard, which would be a public-facing way that the community and elected officials and city government can actually see what is our progress in real time. So we're looking forward to being more open about how we're investing resources, and we now have an accessibility dashboard that does something similar. So how are we making progress toward making our streets more accessible for people with disabilities? So that's our model moving forward, and if you want to see how this looks, you can go to our NOLA.gov website and just NOLA.gov/DPW/accessibility, and that's how we're moving forward. None of this we do a report and then we put a table in the back and then everybody forgets about it and then, oh yeah, we have to do a report again. Let's make it more interactive and easy to use.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, I do want to allow the opportunity from folks here in the audience to ask any questions of the panelists if you have any. Please stand up and raise your hand, and please, yes. Brian, you want to, or?
I think April might take one of those.
Well, I'll take the St. Francisville one. I'm actually helping the town of St. Francisville on Commerce Street, but it's not close to the library, and I'm not sure if your needs are going to be met with this project, but I can introduce you to the mayor and you could talk to him. No, but it's the I don't really want to take the vegetation one, but that's going to come down to local government and process, right? It's a system, and getting the right person to answer the questions. I think there's plenty of stuff online, but it's also finding it and trying to figure out what checklist, what form you have to use. I don't have an easy answer for you. Hopefully they can help better.
That one's pretty tough because a lot of the permits aren't state level permits. That's a local permit that that's where your roadblocks, that's what it sounds like, that's where you're hitting the roadblocks at the local level. So I'd have to reach out to East Baton Rouge and really start there. I wish I had better answers. But
Symphony, we can connect a little bit after the session, and maybe they can provide you a little bit more details on that. And before we wrap up, we got about 2 minutes, so I'm gonna try to squeeze in. This is gonna be rapid fire question and answer session. So
I just wanted to add, you're already streamlining the process by asking for permission to, because the more people come asking for permission, you're clearing, you're problem solving already. And the idea is that if enough people ask, they'll need to provide a more, process of navigating. And the biggest mistake that I've seen in city government is that we make the process way too complicated and we require, everything that we would require of a developer, of a small business or, community organization. So we need to realize when we're doing that and figure out a way to help people navigate the process. So you're already improving the process by asking for permission, is my point.
one more question I think we'll be able to squeeze in before we have to wrap up.
I guess I was wondering from this photos of the streets, the arterial streets that you guys showed us, how do you think design and level of service standards are a baseline and impact what communities can envision and implement for roads and streets in their communities? And how do those impact the actual outcome of those projects, such as Government Street or Plank Road or the ones in New Orleans?
Well, I'll start with saying level of service just go out the window. I mean, we have this like A, B, C, D, F or whatever. I mean, what is that? And an F is like a huge range, right? I mean, like an F, you're sitting in traffic for 5 minutes or an hour, there's a big difference. Level of service isn't necessarily, to me, a good measure of what we're trying to do. But if we start measuring what we're trying to accomplish with transportation by moving people safely, we should measure crashes, we should measure even stormwater mitigation, like the vegetation that she wants to, that's a huge benefit. It mitigates the stormwater runoff from our, impervious surface that we're introducing in pavement. So we need to measure better and not just level of service.
And we are out of time because I know we got to get folks to the break and then we had next session. So we could have probably gone on for another 30 minutes, but I want to thank all of you. Thank Kim. Thank you, April. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Brian. And also to our sponsors, Lipsy's. Y'all enjoy the rest of the session.